Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for coming to our Ignite Innovation event today. Students, faculty, community members, huge thanks to the USD Office of Alumni Relations for their help in promoting this event. Yeah, please make sure you're muted. And if you have questions as the presentation is going, please feel free to put those in the chat, and we will address the questions after our speaker is finished with her presentation. So today's Ignite Innovation event features a fabulous alumna, Michaella Wittmann, electrical engineering alumna from the class of 1992. When I looked up the class of 1992, our database shows a total of 6 students graduating with a degree in electrical engineering that year, 2 of which were women, which isn't bad in terms of odds, but we were a tiny, tiny program. And thankfully, Michaella chose to make her undergraduate career at USD because now she's one of our go-to alums for all kinds of things. She's an alumna that makes us look good in a lot of ways. She's the Director of Sustainability at HDR, which is an international architect and design firm, and she's really led the way in green building design and infrastructure in projects all over the world. She's also the recipient of USD's Arthur E. Hughes Alumni Honors Award from 2019, and is generally just a cool, fun, and interesting human being who I get to call my friend. I'm very glad about that. So before we turn it over to Michaella to do her presentation, I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Venkat Shastri, who's one of our esteemed faculty members. He holds multiple titles, including the De Sanctis Professorship in Engineering and Entrepreneurship, along with being the Associate Director of Graduate Programs and the Director of Industry Partnerships. I'm exhausted just saying all of your titles. Venkat, over to you.
Thank you, Elisa. I'm unmuted now. So to those of you who may not know the Ignite Innovation Speaker Series, this is the one that we're hosting for Spring 22. The program was launched actually during the first year of the pandemic. And our mission was to share the experience of the visionary entrepreneurs and leaders and their stories of grit, resilience, and creativity. And you guys know that resilience is important with what we had with COVID, and we've all been very creative with how to add value to our life. And I cannot think of a better person than Michaella, today's guest, to do this. Her journey at the boundary between technology, business, and sustainability is truly unique. And I hope you all come away as inspired as I am with her story. Michaella leads the Office of Sustainability for HDR, a global firm specializing in engineering, architecture, environmental, and construction services, which, as you know, is traditionally a male-dominated industry. But go Michaella for breaking through the glass ceiling. She and her team focus on adding value to projects by balancing environmental, economic, and social equity goals. Michaella also oversees the firm's initiatives to reduce the impact of HDR's own business practices and an associated emissions reduction goal. She has over 24 years of experience integrating sustainable and climate resilient solutions into projects ranging from building scale to large scale infrastructure projects. She has worked with a broad range of clients, including federal and state agencies, universities, healthcare organizations, and private companies. Infrastructure owners and communities, believe it or not, realize tangible benefits such as reduced environmental impact, increased productivity, improved quality of life, and reduced operation and maintenance expenditures too. Michaella has worked on over 20 projects rated under the LEED, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design rating system, written sustainability guidelines, trained over 4,000 people in various aspects of sustainability, and integrated sustainability into multi-million-dollar infrastructure projects. Many of these are recognized today as Envision Sustainable Infrastructure Rating System verified projects. Michaella is a Fitwel Ambassador, Lead Fellow, and Envision Sustainability Professional. She oversees the integration of Fitwel health and wellness criteria in HDR's own office design with the goal of improving health outcomes for employees working in HDR offices. She also chairs the Envision Review Board for the Institute of Sustainable Infrastructure and represents HDR on the Fitwel Advisory Council. Please help me welcome Michaella to ignite innovation with a round of your Zoom applause.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I appreciate the info. I think most importantly, the thing that was left out is I have a very fun job, and I'm excited to share some things, not about necessarily what I do, but hopefully to give you some ideas for those of you that may be recent grads or even alums that are thinking of ways to integrate sustainability or corporate responsibility into your jobs. It's becoming a huge thing. I was fortunate to start my career very early in sustainability after being hired here at HDR as an electrical engineer, and realizing that the job that I had wasn't centered well with my passion or what I really wanted to do. So I'm going to really spend the most part of today sharing with you some projects, and I try to hone in on some keywords that are industry trends that I know across the global engineering field around the world are common things that I would say, hey, I hesitantly say buzzwords, but areas of expertise that are well in demand. I and my colleagues are having a hard time finding enough professionals to do the really innovative, sustainable, resilient work that we're in demand of, as Lisa said, all over the globe. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me just a minute. All right, well, while I'm doing this, let me just say a couple other things. You'll see the first slides, when I get them up here, are going to be about who HDR is, and I'll just talk about that here for a moment. So we are a global firm of about 1,000 people, 11,000 people. I'm just going to run with this. I'm not seeing the slide to switches, so hopefully bear with me with that.
It's all good. Yeah.
Okay, so we are a global firm of, we're now closing in on 11,000 people, primarily in North America, but we are growing quickly in the UK and Australia, in various markets around the globe. This is a map of where we're currently located. And as both Venkat and Elisa said, we are a consulting engineering firm, and we also have many groups, I should say, of practitioners that do specialty services like sustainability and resiliency. So one of the things that I love about being here in a firm that is not only global, but has so many different areas of expertise. I work alongside colleagues that are transportation experts. I work with biologists, almost any kind of engineer that you can imagine. I work with people that have specialties down as focused of understanding different species of bats, and how we have to be careful of their habitat when we're building bridges, for example. So it's this wonderful broad range of professionals that I work with on a daily basis. And I happen to have the pleasure of leading what we call our Office of Sustainability and Resiliency, which basically has two key components. So I have a small group of folks that have actually very diverse backgrounds, but we act as an internal resource to help drive our projects and our clients to understand how we can address climate, resiliency, greenhouse gas reduction, sustainability in their projects and still get them the results that they want, whether that's a functional bridge, a new hospital, or any other number of types of infrastructure. And we also look inward on our own carbon footprint. So just before this, I was actually meeting with some of our executives talking about, as a company, setting our next carbon reduction goal. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. So we're very sensitive on what we do as a company in our day-to-day business practices, as well as helping our clients understand the value of sustainability for them. So I like this image because really when I say we do just about everything in civil infrastructure, we touch just about everything in civil infrastructure. We work from the building scale. Actually, I should start even bigger. We work on communities, and I'll show you a couple very cool examples where we're helping communities be more resilient. We work at the building scale. Sometimes we work on roadway projects, wind farms, wastewater treatment plants, you name it. So really anything in the built environment, we touch somehow. And that is important in what I do, because now we're getting to the point where some of our more traditional types of projects are really thinking, and infrastructure owners are thinking outside the box. So I don't have a slide about this, but I'll just give you one example, being that it really found a place in my heart. It was a project that we did for an electric utility in Holland, Michigan, where the utility needed to expand. They thought they needed to expand their coal-fired power plant, and they got a lot of pushback from the community. This goes back probably 10 years ago, just suggesting that the community did not want to build more coal. So they did an extensive energy study to take a look at what they might do instead of expand their coal-fired plant. And this really progressive client, it was a board of public works, ended up working with a local university to implement solar technology installation for students on their site. They bought green space to connect some nearby park trails to actually go around the power plant. And they built a museum talking about the transition from coal to natural gas. And it's just a really cool story of how a more traditional infrastructure owner, instead of just building something that had always been done before, decided really to focus on how to make that project something that the community could be proud of. And they did just that. And interestingly, in that case, they have a wait list of folks that actually want to come tour the power plant. And so these next few slides, I'm just going to talk. I think these are some trends. If you're interested in, or maybe you're even new to some of the common themes with regard to sustainability and resiliency that are impacting not just global engineering firms, but other companies across the globe, there are some terms that I thought would be good to introduce you to, or maybe tell you a little more about if you already know them. So the first one is decarbonization. And that is a relatively recent trend, but that is picking up a lot of attention as we move to understand, again, globally, how much impact we're having on the environment. So just for a little bit of context, last August, a group called the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came out with a report that was even more, in my opinion, alarming than ones they put out in the past, about how crucial it is for us as residents of this planet to try to curb global warming. And so there is a move away from fossil fuels, a move to reduce carbon emissions, and really to start to track, whether you're a university or a company like HDR, or a power plant, or a huge company like Google, what your impacts are on the environment. So a lot of what we're doing is helping clients, again, at very different scales, understand what it means to move towards electrification or decarbonization. And I would encourage any of you interested in work in these fields to become familiar with some of these terms that I'm going to share, and I would put decarbonization really at the top of the list. There is a huge need for employees, again, not just within HDR, but that understand the impacts of climate change. And I have a nice summary slide, I think, a little bit later, but I will tell you that for me to be able to do the work I do, and my colleagues to be able to do the work they do, we need economists, meteorologists, hydrologists, stormwater management experts, folks that know how to run climate data models. We need engineers of all types, and there's a huge opportunity in work in these arenas. And this, I think, is a great example of really a sector that's booming right now, and that is doing climate change vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans. So in this case, we worked with the city of Sarasota, Florida, and they wanted to understand those items in red. How are sea level rise, storm surge, extreme heat, and extreme precipitation going to impact us as a city? And they, like most cities, have limited funds, and they, at the end of the day, were really trying to determine where they should spend their money to protect their assets or plan for mitigation. So there are, almost on a daily basis, I get a call from somewhere within our organization saying my client is asking me about how do they prepare for impacts from climate change, and we're building some really interesting teams to provide those type of services to our clients. This is a very similar project, and I'm going to just touch on a couple other examples of this, but this one is interesting because really the intent of this consulting work was to help Hunts Point in the Bronx in New York figure out in that shaded area, the green and the blue, which is really a hub for food security. So there are foods are imported into this area via a couple major transportation routes and from the sea. And there's been increasing concern that this piece of land could be impacted again by sea level rise, storm surge, et cetera. And the New York City Economic Development Corporation actually was concerned that should a major storm hit this area, that food supply to surrounding communities could be disrupted for great lengths of time. So again, we use that very mixed group of professionals to evaluate roadways, sea level rise, look at what the backup plans might be. We looked at resiliency from the standpoint of what kind of renewable energy sources might need to be added to this area to make sure at the end of the day that the risk was minimized for that food security. So really interesting scope of work for us and really interesting outcomes, and that project's still ongoing. So I don't know how many of you may have been to the Florida Keys, but for me personally, this was a disturbing study that we did because I love the Keys, and we were hired again in this case to look at potential impacts to the main highway that runs north-south through the Keys. Again, because of the climate change impacts they're seeing, and also new understandings that are coming, for example, with the collapse of that condo in Surfside, and recognizing that seawater, as the sea rises, is also causing some stability issues. So we are having to help this client look at some challenging questions like, how much of roadways might we need to think about raising, or how many pump stations should we be putting in place to help remove water? And really on the equity side, which is another key thing we're asked to focus on now, how equitable are the decisions we're making to the point that the county thinks that at some point they may have to tell residents that they don't have the money to be able to save their property. So there's some really challenging, not only engineering challenges, but also equity challenges in a lot of the work that is being done globally as well. I'm going to flip through a couple other examples and again, hoping to give you an idea of how much these topics are impacting different type of work. These are just some snapshots of work that we're doing at military installations, across the globe, and helping them look at how to increase resiliency, how to look towards water efficiency. We'll talk about net zero planning in just a little bit, but we have teams of folks that work just on federal projects, helping our federal government recognize goals that they've been set out. Most recently by the Biden administration at the beginning of this year has set some really aggressive goals with regard to renewable power, getting away from cars that are not electric, looking at how to protect military bases on the coast, et cetera. So we have a whole group just focused on federal resiliency and sustainability. We do an awful lot of solar energy project design work and permitting work. And I'll tell you a little bit later about a project that we're working on with a client of ours to, in the renewable space, excuse me, to try and help reduce our own carbon footprint as a company. We do a lot of traditional, I would say, engineering and design work. And an example of a growing area that's related to sustainability is streetcar design. And I'm thrilled. Omaha's not always the most progressive town, but after about a 20-year conversation, we are going to start to implement our streetcar design here in Omaha, which hopefully will help with traffic congestion. Nothing like you have in California, but we do have Midwest level traffic congestion, and also streetcar tends to really result in economic development opportunities as well. This is a very interesting sustainable project, and I'll take a minute to mention Envision, which Venkat referenced when he was doing my introduction. And Envision is a rating system for infrastructure, and we are always looking for professionals that have a credential. That rating system looks at resiliency, resource efficiency, climate leadership, all sorts of topics that are relevant to civil infrastructure projects. And it's basically a checklist or a list of opportunities for implementing solutions of those types. This is the downtown riverfront in Omaha, where I live. And we just helped redesign, I should say, the riverfront to give more access to the water, to make community gathering places, to add a number of different amenities. And we took into account all sorts of things like resiliency, again, looking at recycled materials, moving trees, expanding habitat corridors. And in this particular case, received a platinum environmental rating under that Envision system. So if you are interested in working in the infrastructure arena, that particular rating system of Envision is getting just a lot of momentum, first in the US and Canada, but now across the globe in places like Italy and Mexico. And then back to comments on terminology, excuse me. So net zero, if you haven't heard, is again across the globe becoming a common phrase, as is carbon neutrality. And that is what scientists say we need to strive for in order to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius or even lower, ideally. So we used to, early in my career, talk just about energy efficiency in buildings, for example, and how to make a building as energy efficient as possible. And then the next thread really was, okay, after you make something as energy efficient as possible, how can you incorporate renewable energy? And now the conversation has shifted quickly to how do we get to net zero, which still takes into account those two things, designing for efficiency, considering renewable energy, but then investing to offset the difference in the power that you do need to use. So using HDR as an example, we have cut our emissions by about, well, before COVID, 20% since 2011. But we want to be able to say that we are offsetting all of the energy that we consume as a business. And so we're looking at how to invest in some renewable energy projects to do that. So around the world, cities, universities, government agencies, you name it, are developing net zero plans. It's very exciting, but I would say I've never seen to date this much momentum towards being environmentally sensitive and really trying to curb what's happening with our impacts to the climate. So it's pretty exciting. There's tons of work in this area. Not just in the infrastructure side, but certainly in the work that I'm doing, it's become front and center. And here's actually a couple of examples, I think, too, in your neck of the woods. So we have, no surprise, some progressive clients in California that are looking at net zero planning. And the city of LA and the county of LA have both set net zero targets. So we went to great lengths in this project in LA for DWP to make this building net zero. And if anyone's interested in the technical side of these, I'd be happy to share some information as a follow-up into the calculations and evaluations that went into this design. This client also, as is now going to be required in California, we have to look at the embodied carbon of materials. So that is taking a look at how much carbon is required to create materials like concrete and steel and drywall. So we are having to up our game in terms of understanding how to use embodied carbon calculators, which is above my head. But if you are an in the weeds type of person that loves calculations and details, there's going to be a huge market for folks that know how to interpret embodied carbon calculations. And this is pretty brand new. Of course, California is the first in the US to require it. And we're, like I said, we're evaluating how to stay on top of that as an organization. Another net zero project in Orange County. If you were to Google this project, the county has won a lot of awards for this administrative and laboratory building because of how environmentally sensitive it is. Mass timber is a relatively new trend, I would say. Mass timber has very low embodied carbon, and so this is a project that we designed where the client really wanted to structure the design of this facility around the use of mass timber, and that's been becoming more popular as well. This is actually an interesting project, very sad in a way, and related to the huge impacts of climate change on entire communities. So this is a city in the Pacific Northwest that is now, or is currently, I should say, on the banks of a river that floods, increasingly so in recent years. And they actually, this community of about 600 homes collectively came together and decided that it was not resilient or sustainable to continue to live where they are, and they want to move their whole town up the hill. So there's been a really interesting program and project, multiple companies coming together to talk about how they might help this community move, where the funding might come from, and in doing so, how they could really work at developing a net zero community design. So what might have been thought of as a crazy idea even 10 to 12 years ago is these are the kinds of conversations that we're having to date because of the impacts at a broad scale. And then as I transition to a different topic, related, but different topic, I just wanted to share this slide, which is just a word diagram of common terms, common themes, areas of expertise that are, again, in high demand. I'll just take a minute and let you take a look at those. And my mouse just happened to roll over my swap button. So here we go, halfway through, I can switch it. So when I stop looking, I always find things. Zero waste, counties and cities and campuses trying to get to zero waste, renewable energy expertise is huge. That's another area we have a hard time finding enough experts in. What else I want to point out? Circular economy, also becoming very popular. It was sort of a niche market maybe 8 to 10 years ago, and we now have projects where we're helping clients figure out how to turn their waste back into usable products. That's pretty fun. Sustainable materials, greenhouse gas accounting. If you were to get a certificate in greenhouse gas accounting, you would also be in high demand. So just a lot of exciting times regarding career development. Again, if you're new and coming into the workforce, you'll hear a lot about all these topics, really regardless of what industry you might go in. So I'm going to shift gears here just and tell you a little bit about our commitment, and this what I will share with you, I think, is important from a couple perspectives, in that we have, especially amongst young professionals, one of the most common topics or themes that we're being asked is what our commitment is to the planet, to diversity, to equity, to leadership. And we have a very high level program focused on this. So just a few things that we've done. There's an annual climate summit every year. Many of you may know that. The most recent one was held in the UK in October. And there was a commitment that was floating around the globe asking organizations to sign what was called COP26, just recognizing, if you were willing to sign on, that it is important as global leaders to reduce carbon in our projects and internally. And HDR is one of those AE firms that signed on to that, and people that we're hiring and our clients care. So I won't name the name, but a very large data center owner has come to HDR within the last couple of years saying, we are only going to work with consultants that make significant commitments to the environment. And so is a way for us to even be able to do business in some cases. These kind of commitments are important to us and essential, I would say, to us as an organization. So interestingly, I talked about greenhouse gas emission inventories, and that's basically HDR calculating based on how much we travel to clients or how we commute to work or the offices where we consume energy, what our impacts are in terms of carbon. And we set a goal in 2011 to reduce our impacts by 20% by 2020. And at the end of 2019, we had reduced 19.1%. And because of COVID, we saw a huge jump because we didn't travel and because we worked from home. And so we're kind of having to level set to look at, as we transition back to work, what our impacts are going to be. But it was an interesting exercise for us to see, just based on where we work and how much we travel, what a significant impact just those two things are on the planet. We also have internal waste reduction goals that we put upon ourselves, as well as to the contractors that build the projects that we design. We have a pretty extensive composting program, not in all of our offices, but in as many as we can, including here. I sit in our global headquarters that has almost 1,000 people in it, and we have an extensive composting program. And there's a great success story there, in that we live in a mixed-use development, and the developer who designed this whole area now has come in to learn from us and implemented a compost program for the community itself. We do a sustainability and corporate responsibility report every year as another actual business opportunity. There are a lot of companies that actually their main line of work is writing sustainability reports for clients. We happen to do ours internally, but if you are a writer or like the more storytelling part of engineering, or really any of the different types of industries are putting out responsibility reports. Another term for those now is environmental social governance, or ESG reports. And this is actually our headquarters. We are located in the heart of Omaha. And when we designed our building, we took into account to try to do all the things that practice what we preach, I guess. And so we really looked through a few different lenses. We're a design firm, so of course our architects and engineers wanted to have an aesthetically pleasing building, but we also made sure that we addressed a multitude of health and wellness features. There is a health and wellness ratings system for buildings. It's called Fitwell. You see it there on the bottom, FITWEL. There's a huge growth in the organization that manages Fitwell. Lots of focus on health and wellness in buildings. So we did things here like we have a whole healthy food court downstairs. We actually, pre-COVID, had a cafe. We have maps for internally and for cold days, and externally how to connect to local park trails. We did all sorts of things to encourage movement. We have a lot of open staircases that are aesthetically designed to encourage people to move around. So we focused on health and wellness, and we also focused on sustainability and have a LEED green building rating certificate for this project as well. So we, as much as we try to do for our clients and our communities, we try to address internally in the way we do business and the offices in which we work as well. And then this is a slide I felt inclined to pull in for this audience. And I think one of the wonderful things about working in a firm that's always designing is more and more getting the opportunity to think outside the box. This was a competition that we did in 2020, and the focus was on thinking or putting down all requirements as an engineer. So forget about design guidelines, forget about design code requirements, etc. for this competition, just to think of ways that you could bring hope to communities across the world. And some of my colleagues, actually out of our Northeast offices, came up with this idea of having these bubbles, as they call them, bubbles of hope, that could be moved into a community if there was a pandemic or a water disaster or a power crisis, to give people places of respite. We won second place, but we do engage in a lot of things to really think about how we can give back to communities and make the places that we work and live inspirational, more healthy, and more resilient. So just thought I'd share that on a fun note. And then I want to wrap up my part and leave time for questions just about career opportunities for anyone that's looking for a change or looking for a job or about to graduate. So these happen to be 5 principles that we hold sincerely internally, and we're reminded of daily. And I would, regardless of looking at HDR or elsewhere, I would suggest encouraging really to understand the culture and not just the job that you might be pursuing. I think it's critically important, especially today when there's so much focus on people and the people we work with and not just the jobs we do. We happen to be an employee-owned company, which is pretty amazing. HDR is one of the only few very large AEC firms that has that culture of ownership. And that's something, again, regardless if it's with the company I happen to work for, things to think about as you're venturing out. And Elise, I hope it's okay for this little plug. I usually say something about this at the end of my presentations with USD, because we typically have lots of graduates on the line as well, or students. And we have a pretty great, a simple to use career search box and a special place for internships. So hope that little plug is okay, but mostly as I started saying at the beginning, I really just wanted to share some of what I obviously am personally passionate about, but I know that there's just such a wonderful shift across industries, focusing on the people and the planet, communities at large, and there's lots of work to be done. So I was just joking with someone the other day that I've been doing this personally now for 20 years. I started my sustainability career in the mid-90s, but I feel some days we're just starting the journey because there's so much left to do. So I would encourage you, if these topics are of interest to you, to engage. There's plenty of ways, even if it's outside of your career. And as always, I'm always happy to entertain questions now, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Or Twitter if you have any follow-up questions outside of the conversation we're having today.
Thank you so much, Michaella. That was very illuminating and so interesting that you guys are on the cutting edge of all of this. You can probably stop sharing your screen, and yep. I'm gonna have Venkat go ahead and lead the Q&A, and if there are questions, please feel free to put those in the chat or raise your hand if you want, and we can call on you. I know there were a few questions that came in prior to the talk, so Venkat, I'm going to turn it over to you. Oh, you are muted.
So I'm going to pretend like I'm super intelligent and give you one of those questions that came by web.
Okay.
What was the most important piece of advice that someone has given you that has helped you in your career?
So that was an easy one for me, because I actually use this all the time when I'm speaking, and especially when I'm working with young folks. When I first went to our architecture president in the mid-90s and said I wanted to chat about sustainability, and I had an idea, I came with my very personal passion in mind, and he actually told me the second time I met with him to remember that in the position that I was in, if this was going to go anywhere for HDR, meaning if sustainability was to grow, that I had to always remember to think about the value to our staff and to our clients. And I still think about that all the time in terms of bringing new ideas to the table, or thinking about changes in the way I do business, is to make sure to be thinking about how it brings value, in this case, because we're consultants, to our clients and to my colleagues. So simple piece of advice, but it's served me well many, many times over the years.
Okay, do we have any raised hands? Well, then I'm going to ask a second question. What do you see as a natural transition of focus from early adopters of sustainability technologies to the more general populace?
So if I would love to know if the person that asked that question is on, if you want to expand on that, I could answer that a few different ways. And if they're not, I'm happy to take a stab at answering that with a couple different comments. Okay, so I'll jump in if anyone wants to chat about that, or chat a response, or not a response, but more info. So as I thought about that question, there I thought I wasn't sure if you're asking about how maybe tools and technology are transferring, but I think most importantly, I would say that I feel like we're at a tipping point of passing some of the more progressive ideas to the general populace. I will say I know for a fact that there will always be folks that, including some I'm related to, I would say, that aren't believers in the need for or sustainable responsibilities, but I feel like at this point, the ethical piece of addressing climate change and sustainability and diversity and equity is becoming much more mainstream. I know for sure when I started my career, it was not, and there are all sorts of signs about that for me, like the fact that you can now go into almost every common retailer and find sustainable products, or you can look on most company websites and find something about their commitments to sustainability or their reports on what they're doing for sustainability. I think the things that have happened in the last 12 months, like COP26 and that IPCC report that I mentioned, and even some of the equity incidents, I would say, that happened over the last couple of years are really moving the needle quickly. So again, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question that was intended, but I think we're getting to the point that the topics we talked about today really are becoming much more mainstream.
Thank you. So here's one that came in the chat box. It's from Jeff Teaser. What are your thoughts regarding how to apportion investments focused on reducing CO2 emissions versus adapting to the inevitable temperature changes?
Read the very first part of that again. I just want to make sure I caught the few first words, Michaella, as you framed it.
What are your thoughts regarding how to apportion investments?
Apportion investment. Okay, that was the part I thought I missed. So it's a great question. My personal opinion, well, I guess just some facts. So I mentioned the term ESG, or environmental social governance. There is a huge move from investors across the globe to put their investments in companies, publicly traded companies that have environmental social governance reports, including commitments to reduce CO2. That is soon to become a requirement in the US per the Security and Exchange Commission. It's already a requirement in many parts of the globe. So just factually, it will continue to be a drive towards investment in carbon reduction and environmental responsibility. I personally think it's inevitable that we're going to see continued significant impact on climate change. However, regardless of what we do as a global community, including firms like the one I work for, we're still going to have to adapt some. So I think that it has to be a balance. I think it's critically important for those investments to go to carbon reduction, but it's not going to be enough, nor, unfortunately, are there common, there's not always ability, especially in some parts of the world, to focus on that topic of carbon reduction. There are all sorts of other, as we all know, population issues, global crises, economic issues that just don't allow everyone to address that. So a combination is the short answer.
So Michaella, I have a question, and this goes to a combination of what we've been seeing in COVID and notions of equity.
Yeah.
So COVID forced us to stay at home and work. So, our corporate footprint in terms of carbon emissions came down. But on the other hand, if you really look at how much the increase of single-use plastic has gone through in the last couple of years, and where they land up is the landfills in underdeveloped parts of the world, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, aren't we looking at this notion of carbon footprint a little parochially? Shouldn't we expand it in the way we look at it?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you asked that. I was just having a conversation about this the other day, and one of the biggest challenges is, and I'm getting a little in the weeds here, but carbon footprint is calculated based on something called scope 1, 2, and 3. And 1 and 2 are the easier to measure. So the energy we use, the fuels that we use, just the more direct emissions, and the things you're talking about, plastics, for example, and other things you purchase are called scope 3. They're indirect impacts, and they're the hardest to measure. So part of the challenge is that, you know, someone might say, well, you might have reduced energy, but what about all the waste, all the plastic, all the masks, all the biohazardous material, et cetera? And there's today not a good way to measure a lot of the scope 3. It's our biggest challenge as a company. It's a lot of others too. And that's something that industry is trying to address, but it's a big gap that we have, honestly.
So that goes into the second question that I got on the web. How do you work with community members to ensure that nearby sustainability-related infrastructure projects benefit from what you do, / do not get upended because of what you do in the quality of life?
Yeah, so that was a great question to whoever asked that. And I will say we're learning as we go, and it's evolving, but there are some tools. The state of California actually has some equity focused tools that have been developed, just as an example, to look at maybe both economics, what am I trying to say, gender diversity, and all sorts of different demographics in a community to really be able to dive in and look at what are the prevalent social issues that should be addressed. We have developed some tools internally through a group we call strategic communications, where we seek input, and it's very, very common now on almost every project we do to seek input from the communities that will be impacted. For example, in the expansion of BART in the Bay Area, we have a massive community engagement process, some of it in person, some of it online, some via texting, where we're trying to really get in and understand the impacts, and not just the impacts, but the desires of the community, so that they are often getting a voice in the project as well. And again, 10 years ago, a lot of times that input might have been one way. You would seek input, but it wouldn't really influence project outcomes. And there's really a responsibility we feel we have now, and communities expect that you engage with them. So yeah, that's a great question. But stakeholder engagement using tools that are available, and now we even have equity managers in the company who are experts in looking at how our projects will impact the community. It's another growing career opportunity in that field specifically.
Other questions? Well, then I have one more.
Okay, I'm ready.
So part of your consultancy business, do you also provide ESG reporting as a part of your consulting business? And so how do you actually, based on that, see the ESG reporting across the board grow and become more meaningful? And what are the tangible benefits? If I'm a building owner, does it mean that the value of my property is going to go up? What are the tangible benefits I see besides just energy reduction?
So I didn't plant that with Venkat, but actually my most recent ask from our C-suite is to develop an ESG framework. And we have been using the term corporate responsibility, but we have actually been reporting on ESG for a long time. So the benefit depends on who you are as a company. If you're, as I mentioned, publicly traded, if you want equity investors, you need to have ESG. In the UK, it's a requirement, actually, for example. For us, we do it because we think it's the right thing to do. We've always been very involved in communities. It's a retention and recruiting benefit for us as a company. And for us, again, because we're employee owned, and we hear loud and clear that these topics are important to our employees, and they want to invest in something that's meaningful for them. In some cases, it's business critical. I mentioned the example before of a data center owner who has told us, if you don't have an ESG plan, we may look elsewhere. So it depends on what type of company you are. Sometimes it's necessity, it's the right thing to do, legislatively required in some areas. And we're finding a lot of opportunities. I think we've done a lot on the E side, the environmental side. We're looking at third party, we're looking at more social focused initiatives. So it really depends on the company that you are, but I would say, I can't think of a case where having an ESG, even just a framework, wouldn't be valuable.
Any other questions? If not, I'm going to ask the final question. Okay, so the final question is that we have a lot of young people on the Zoom call, not to say I'm not young, but younger than me. So, Michaella, if I were to ask you, roll the tape 15, 20 years out, and we don't grow old, what do you see is the nature and how will the world look to us from a sustainability point of view?
Oof. Some days, that's a great question. That's a tough one, because I honestly, if you had asked me 2 years ago, I wouldn't have had any idea that we would have the momentum that we do today. But I think that what I'm seeing is that through technology, both on the solution side, whether that's carbon sequestration technology or software technology, like I mentioned, the embodied carbon tools, I will tell you, I've gone in and dabbled way over my head in terms of what those calculators are trying to do. So I think that we'll see huge movement in innovation and technology that come out of the crisis that we're in. I think that we'll look at our whole financial system is starting to shift to look at topics of climate risk and business continuity, for example. So if I had to summarize, I would say sophistication in what we're doing, a lot of it driven just by pure demand of what we need to do.
Okay. Now is the time. Any other questions?
Thank you for the good ones.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all very much. And thank you, Michaella.
Thank you so much, Michaella. Always so illuminating. And for the students online, if you're interested in learning more, you can look Michaella up on LinkedIn, or you can get in touch with any of us and we can put you in touch. There is an HDR office in San Diego, so you might check that out. Thank you. That was fantastic. So please join me in another round of Zoom applause.
Zoom applause. Thank you all. And yes, from my engagement last month, I have about 6 or 8 new USD connections on LinkedIn. So I'm always happy to do that.
Terrific. Okay. Well, thank you. That was great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.